China's growing demand for commodities has reshaped global trade, and Brazil has emerged as one of the biggest beneficiaries, becoming Beijing's dominant agricultural supplier. But as that relationship deepens, questions are emerging about dependence on both sides and whether shifting US China trade negotiations could disrupt the balance. Now, a new variable has hit the system. Escalating conflict involving Iran is pushing up global energy and shipping risk, with renewed concerns around the Strait of Hormuz and knock-on effects for fuel, freight, and fertilizer costs. To explore what's structural, what's political, and where the risks lie, I'm joined by Arlan Suderman, Chief Commodities Economist at StoneX. Welcome back, Arlan.
Good to be back with you once again.
So I'm sure you're very busy, so I'll get straight to the point. Let's start with China-Brazil commodities relationship. How important has it become, and what makes this phase different from previous cycles?
Well, I think to some extent Brazil and China were a marriage made in heaven, so to speak. China has 1.4 billion people roughly, although that is declining on an annual basis now. But it needs to take care of those people, needs to feed them, needs to build infrastructure, etc. Brazil is rich in natural resources, ground to be able to grow food, based commodities, the iron ore that it can mine, many different commodities that China could utilize. Brazil could utilize, particularly early on in its development, could use the investment that China could offer it to build its infrastructure, to build its agriculture, to build its mining capacity, etc. And so the two were able to start working together over the last several decades to be able to develop this. Brazil is also not a direct threat to China, as China would see the United States as being a threat. Brazil really doesn't have a power base, so to speak, that is a threat to China. So it's really kind of one of those marriages that China's been courting now for quite some time.
Well, you basically just answered my next question because I was going to say, why has Brazil been so successful? Is this just about trade tensions, or are there deeper structural advantages? But you just mentioned some, unless you want to chime in with something else.
Yeah, there's some other advantages it has as well. Basically, being a tropical nation, now it's a very massive country, but it has significant farming country, natural resources in areas that are relatively tropical. And what that means is a year-round growing season, so to speak. So the same ground can produce two crops and maybe even sometimes three crops. So they can grow a soybean crop, harvest the soybeans, and plant a corn crop. And that gives them some real significant advantages. And then when you look at their currency being relatively cheap versus the United States, the US dollar, that means if they can produce it more efficiently, lower cost than what the United States can do, and then when they have it to sell, it's easier to convert yuans into rias than it is yuans into dollars from a currency exchange standpoint. China can actually buy those commodities cheaper from Brazil then as well. So there's those advantages structurally help Brazil in its relationship with China.
So then, from China's perspective, is this diversification away from the US, or is China becoming dependent on Brazil in the process?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Certainly, China, when it has stated that it wants to become the number one economy in the world, overtaking the United States, why should it continue to send its money to the United States to help keep building the US economy when it could send its money elsewhere, has an alternative source? And so, from that standpoint, that makes sense overall. When we look at is it becoming dependent upon Brazil? Yes. But I think it's very comfortable with that dependency right now because it doesn't see Brazil as a threat. Brazil has no desire necessarily to be the number one economy in the world. It was just wants to continue to grow as an economy and wants to be a very rich agricultural and natural resource country. And that fits well with China's objectives. So China doesn't see that as the same threat that it would from the United States.
Understood. So Trump and Xi are meeting in a few weeks' time. Could we see China redirect some of its purchases back towards the US as part of a broader deal?
Yeah, this is a constantly evolving picture right now. I've already described how economically Brazil is going to be able to undercut the United States, especially for soybeans, which is the commodity that is getting most of the focus, with massive quantities of soybeans now shifting from the United States to Brazil as a source. But as we look at the relationship between the United States and China, it's a little bit of a love-hate relationship. And a lot of that has to do with internal politics within China right now. As we look at President Xi's power base within China, he had built quite a power base in recent years during his terms in office as president of China. But President Trump's actions against China have significantly hurt the Chinese economy. And I don't want to say that he doesn't care about the common person so much, but from a political standpoint, if he wants another term in office, his real power base he has to be concerned about is within the Communist Party of China and within the military. And every 5 years, the Communist Party has its big uh, political party meetings, and that took place about the third week of October of last year. And at that point, that was really a turning point. He came out of those meetings really sensing the cracks in the support base that he had. And so he quickly inked a deal with the United States with President Trump to be able to start turning the waters, so to speak, to be able to start turning things around internationally so he could start focusing on building and regaining his support base within China. He started purging the military of anyone in leadership he felt like wasn't loyal to him. Call it insecure if you want, but it is what it is. And that went to 9 different leaders, generals, lieutenant generals, etc. 5 of the top 6 generals responsible for giving leadership to the army through the Central Military Commission were arrested on corruption charges. That shows the level of fear that Xi had. And so he really needed President Trump. And if it meant paying $1.40 per bushel extra for soybeans in order to get concessions from President Trump, to get greater access to our consumer market, to get greater foreign investment into their economy, or to be able to get the chips that he needs in China that we produce, then that was a small price to pay. But here within the last couple of weeks, China's highest legislative branch, which is essentially the Communist Party, formally removed those 9 leaders from the military. That helps rebuild his support base within the Communist Party, puts him in a little bit stronger negotiating position with President Trump. And suddenly, coincidentally, if you will, negotiators said that their negotiations with President Xi kind of hit a rough spot. So I do think that there is a real chance during this window of opportunity that Xi is trying to rebuild his power base within China for the US to sell commodities to China. But once he reestablishes, assuming he does reestablish his power base, that is the direction he's moving now, then I think that he'll start closing the door again and shift that demand back to Brazil.
Well, I wanted to ask because let's assume that everything does go well and there is a deal between the US and China. What would that mean for Brazil? Because is Brazil at risk of overdependence on Chinese demand, especially if Chinese buying becomes more explicitly geopolitical, which is what you just mentioned?
Yeah, I do think that they are at risk. Anytime you're dependent upon one country to buy your products, you're at risk of what's happening there. And while China may want to do all of its business with Brazil, it's a game of chess right now, and there may be short-term reasons why it may do its business elsewhere, like the United States. And so, soybeans again, for example, the world has plenty of soybeans. Brazil's on currently harvesting another record crop. China doesn't need US soybeans, but if they choose to buy them for these internal political reasons, then it's a job of the marketplace to reshuffle where the soybeans are at because the US doesn't necessarily have additional soybeans to sell, assuming we get a strong biofuel program here in a few weeks. And so what the market would have to do is raise US prices to price out non-China business to send our non-China business to Brazil to get its soybeans, while Brazil prices go down to attract that business. And we've already seen some of that happening already. And even the United States, we would probably see imports of Brazilian beans into the Southeast feed markets to help make the balance sheet work, reshuffling the world supplies to kind of do that. That's inefficient from a market standpoint, but it's for political reasons, not for economical reasons.
Well, now on top of all of that, let's add one new variable to the list, the Iran escalation. We've seen energy and shipping risks jump. Does that reshuffle the China, Brazil, US commodity relationship, or does it just mainly change the cost structure and negotiating leverage?
It does change the cost structure. For example, Brazil buys a lot of fertilizer from Iran. And there's a lot of trade between Brazil and Iran. And in fact, when you look at overall, first comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly, we're looking at about a third of the world's urea goes through the Strait of Hormuz. About 20 to 25% of the anhydrous ammonia goes through there. Most of the phosphate we import into the United States goes through there. So fertilizer is a major factor, obviously, but it does increase costs, particularly for Brazil, but also for the world, and also freight. If we can't go through the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, if ships are tied up waiting to go through the strait, cannot be transporting items, we're lengthening freight times, we're increasing freight costs, we're increasing insurance costs. All of it is inflationary in nature.
Okay, and if we step back for a moment, do you think that this phase is a temporary geopolitical recalibration, or do you think it's more long-term realignment in global commodity flows? And does the Iran shock accelerate any of those trends?
I see it as a short-term recalibration. Of course, you could throw in the Ukraine war, what if it would end or something like that to go in that as well. But it's a short-term recalibration. Assuming that President Xi is able to reestablish his power base, he will focus back on Brazil at that point and be in a position to play more hardball again with the United States. Of course, President Trump is just, so to speak, a short timer with less than 3 years left. If he loses Congress, that could further weaken his agenda as well if he loses Congress in the midterm elections in November. President Xi is all aware of that. That's part of the chess game that is going on among world leaders right now. So I think long term, we look for China to continue to try to establish their power base, their strength economically and militarily. United States try to defend theirs. That means more ongoing conflict between China and the United States. Throw the Taiwan into the equation as well. Once President Xi is able to reestablish the leadership in his military, that is coming on down the road. And overall, I think long term, that means Brazil and China have a longer relationship after we get through this near term recalibration.
Understood. Arlan, thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you to our viewers for watching. For more financial content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.